11. The KGB. Bourne and Marie drove south to the small city of Corbeil-Essonnes, where there was a new shopping center several kilometers west of the highway. From a public telephone, Bourne placed a call to Vienna, Virginia, but Alex Conklin wasn't there. Instead, there was the voice of a recorded operator saying, "The telephone number you have called is no longer in service." Bourne called the apartment in Washington and heard another recorded voice. "This is Alex," it said. "I'll be away for some time visiting a place where a grave error was made. Call me in 5 or 6 hours. It's now 9:30 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. Out, Juliet." Stunned, his mind spinning, Bourne hung up the phone and stared at Marie. Something's happened, and I have to make sense of it. His last words were, "Out, Juliet." "Juliet," Marie said. "Hotel India Juliet. It's the international radio operator's alphabet. Juliet's for J, and J is for Jason. What was the rest?" "He's visiting somewhere where a grave error was made." "What?" "He said to call him in 5 or 6 hours. He was visiting a place where a grave error." "Grave? My God. It's Rambouillet." "The cemetery?" "Where he tried to kill me 13 years ago. When he thought I'd changed sides. That's it. Rambouillet." "Not in 5 or 6 hours, objected Marie. "Whenever he left the message, he couldn't fly to Paris and then drive to Rambouillet in 5 hours. He was in Washington." "Of course he could. We've both done it before. An Army jet out of Andrews Air Force Base to Paris." Bourne suddenly looked at his watch. "It's still only around noon in the islands. Let's find another phone." "Johnny? Tranquility? You really think—" "I can't stop thinking," interrupted Bourne, rushing ahead. "There's a phone inside, over there," he said, approaching the huge windows of an ice cream shop. "Get me a chocolate one," he said, leading Marie into the crowded store. Bourne crossed to the phone, immediately understanding why it was not used. The noise of the store was almost unbearable. 3 minutes later, holding his hand against his left ear, Bourne had the unexpected comfort of hearing Tranquility Hotel's most annoying employee over the phone. "This is Mr. Pritchard, Tranquility Hotel's assistant manager. May I inquire as to the nature of your—" "You can shut up," shouted Bourne. "Get Johnny St. Jacques on the phone now. This is his brother-in-law." "Of course, sir. One moment, please." "Johnny?" "David, where are you?" "That doesn't matter. Get out of there. Take the kids and Mrs. Cooper and get out." "We know all about it. Alex Conklin called several hours ago and said somebody named Holland would reach us. I gather he's the chief of your intelligence service?" "He is. Did he?" "Yeah, about 20 minutes after I talked to Alex. He told us we're being taken out by helicopter around 2 o'clock this afternoon. David, what the hell is going on? Where's Marie?" "She's all right. I'll explain everything later. Just do as Holland says." "Did he say where you were being taken?" "He didn't want to. But no American is going to order me and your kids around, my Canadian sister's kids. He said we were going to a safe house in Virginia. It's on a piece of land in Fairfax with no public entry and its own airfield." "I know the place," said Bourne. "It's called Tannenbaum. He's right. It's the best of the safe houses. He likes us." "I asked you before, where's Marie?" "She's with me." "She found you?" "Later, Johnny. I'll reach you in Fairfax." Bourne hung up the phone. They met at Rambouillet and drove to a small country restaurant. Alex Conklin, Mo Panoff, Jason Bourne and Marie Webb. The family was together. They sat around a table at the back. The owner said that the cooking was extraordinary, but since nobody was hungry, Bourne paid for 4 starters to keep the owner happy. "We'll be working with the Soviets," Conklin said. "It's all right. Holland arranged it, and I know the contact. I've known him for years, but Washington doesn't know that I know him. His name is Krupkin, Dmitri Krupkin, and he can be bought and paid for." "For how much?" Marie asked. "Considering his position in the Paris KGB, I'd say around 50,000 American dollars. "Offer him 35, Marie said, "and go up to 75 under pressure. Up to 100 if necessary, of course." "For God's sake," cried Bourne, "we're talking about us, about the jackal. Give him anything he wants. We have the money." "Too easily bought by us, too easily bought by the other side." "Is she right?" asked Bourne, staring at Conklin. "Normally, of course, but in this case it would have to be something like a diamond mine. Nobody wants Carlos in the dead file more than the Soviets, and the man who brings in his dead body will be the hero of the Kremlin. Remember, Carlos was trained at Novgorod. Moscow never forgets that." "Then do as she says. Buy him," said Bourne. "I understand." Conklin leaned forward. "I'll call him tonight, payphone to payphone, and get it settled. Then I'll arrange a meeting tomorrow, maybe lunch somewhere outside Paris." "Why not here?" asked Bourne. "It's quiet and I'll know how to get here." "Why not?" agreed Conklin. "I'll talk to the owner." He turned to the others. "But not the 4 of us, just Jason and me." "I assumed that," said Bourne coldly. "Marie must not be involved. She must not be seen or heard. Is that clear?" "David," said Marie angrily, "you cannot and will not order me around. Do you understand that?" "Loud and clear, lady. Then maybe you should go back to the States so you won't have to listen to me." Jason Bourne rose from the table, pushing the chair behind him. "Tomorrow's going to be a busy day, so I have to get some sleep. I'll be in the car for 2 minutes. You decide whether to stay or go. I'm sure Alex can get you out of France." Bourne turned and walked away. "Go to him," said Panoff quickly. "You know what's happening." "I can't handle it, Mo." "Don't handle it. Just be with him. You're the only support he's got. You don't even have to talk. Just be there with him. He's become the killer again." "Then provide him with that link to David Webb. It has to be there, Marie." "Oh, God, I love him so much," cried the wife, rushing to her feet and racing after the man who was her husband, but not her husband. "Was that the right advice, Mo?" asked Conklin. "I don't know, Alex. I just don't think he should be alone with his terrors. None of us should. That's not psychiatry, it's just common sense." "Sometimes you sound like a real doctor, you know that?" The Algerian section of Paris lies between the 10th and 11th districts, barely 3 blocks, where the low buildings are Parisian, but the sounds and the smells are Arabic. A long black limousine entered this district, the badge of the Roman Catholic Church in gold on the doors. It stopped in front of a wood-framed 3-floor house, where an old priest got out and walked to the door. He pressed a button that rang a bell on the 2nd floor. "Yes?" said the metallic voice from upstairs. "I am a messenger from the American Embassy," answered the visitor. I can't leave my vehicle, but we have an urgent message for you." "I'll be right down," said the French-Algerian driver who worked for the Americans. 3 minutes later, the man came out of the building. "What are you dressed like that for?" he asked the messenger, who stood by the large car, covering the badge on the door. "I'm the embassy's Catholic priest, my son. A member of staff would like a word with you." He opened the car door. "Yes, sir. What can I do for you?" said the driver as he bent down to look inside the limousine. "Where did you take our people?" asked the shadowed figure in the darkness. "What people?" said the Algerian, concern in his voice. "The two you picked up at the airport several hours ago, the limping man and his friend. If you're from the embassy and they want you to know, they'll call and tell you, won't they?" "You'll tell me." A third powerfully built man in a driver's uniform appeared from behind the trunk of the car. He walked rapidly forward, raising his arm and crashing a stick down on the Algerian's head. He pushed his victim inside. The old man dressed as a priest climbed in behind him, pulling the door shut as the driver ran around to the front seat. The limousine raced away. An hour later, on the deserted Rue Houdon, the Algerian's bruised and bleeding dead body was pushed out of the large car. Inside, the figure in shadows addressed the priest. "Get your car and remain outside the Limping One's hotel. Report any movements and go where he goes. Don't fail me." "Never, sir." Dmitri Krupkin was seated at a table in the country restaurant, staring across the table at Alex Conklin, who sat beside the unidentified Bourne. "So, my dear old enemy," Krupkin said, "how and where will I be paid according to our agreement last night on the telephone?" "How and where do you want to be paid?" asked Bourne. "Aha! You are my employer, sir." "I'll be paying you, yes." "I shall write down the name of a bank and the number of an account in Geneva," the Soviet said. He reached into his pocket for a pen, but was not able to use it because a man in his early 30s walked rapidly up to the table. "What is it, Sergei?" asked Krupkin. "You have been followed. An old man in a grey car. He arrived soon after you did, looked at the name of the restaurant, then used the car telephone." "That old man's from the Jackal," said Bourne. "Carlos!" cried Krupkin, his blue eyes angry. "The Jackal's after you, Alexei?" "No, him," answered Conklin, pointing at Bourne. "Good God! With what we've learned in Moscow, it's all making sense. So, I have the honor to meet the famous Jason Bourne. A great pleasure, sir. We have the same aim where Carlos is concerned, do we not?" "If your men are good, we may achieve that aim before the end of the next hour. Let's get out of here and use the back way, the kitchen. He's found me, and you can bet he's coming out here for me. But he doesn't know that we know that. Let's go." As the three men rose from the table, Krupkin gave instructions to his assistant. "Have the car brought around to the back, Sergei." "Of course, comrade." The assistant hurried back to the entrance. They left through the kitchen and waited in Krupkin's Citroën on the edge of a field. Suddenly, a dark brown limousine shot up the road from the highway to Paris. It pulled to a stop in front of the restaurant, and two men leaped out of the side door, their faces covered, their hands holding automatic weapons. A third man came out of the vehicle, wearing a priest's black clothing. Suddenly there was an ear-splitting scream of revenge from the Jackal as the terrorists rushed inside, their weapons on automatic fire. "Now!" cried Sergei. The Citroën swung out on the road, rushing toward the limousine. But in a split second its progress was stopped. A huge explosion took place on the right. The old man, the informer, and the gray car in which he was sitting were blown up, sending the Citroën to the left into a fence. "Get out!" shouted Sergei, pulling Bourne from the seat onto the dirt by the fence, as his stunned superior and Alex Conklin crawled out behind him. "Let's go!" cried Bourne. "He blew up the car!" They ran to the front doors of the restaurant and burst inside. The next 60 seconds were like a scene from hell. The waiter and 2 male customers were dead, lying on the floor with blood running from their heads. Women screamed. Sergei suddenly rushed forward, his weapon on automatic fire. In a back corner of the room, he had spotted a figure whom Bourne had not seen. The killer leaped out of the shadows, and the Soviet shot him. But it was not Carlos. Where was the jackal? "In there!" shouted Sergei, pointing to the kitchen. Both men moved toward the swinging doors, but were partially blown back by an explosion from within. A grenade had been thrown. The smoke blew out into the dining room. Bourne crashed through the doors and threw himself flat. Silence. Another scene from another hell. A section of the outside wall had been blown away. The owner and his cook were dead, blood streaming across the floor. Bourne slowly rose to his feet, his legs in great pain. He looked through the smoke, his eyes finally settling on a large piece of paper fixed to the wall by a kitchen knife. He approached it and read the words printed in black pen. "The trees of Tannenbaum will burn, and so will the children. Sleep well, Jason Bourne." The mirrors of his life exploded into 1,000 pieces of glass. There was nothing else to do except scream. Chapter 12. The Apartment. The gray Citroën was parked 100 meters away from the entrance of Dominique Lavier's apartment building on the fashionable Avenue Montaigne. Krupkin, Conklin, and Bourne sat in the back. Sergei could be seen walking out of the glass doors. He crossed the wide street toward the Citroën, reached the car, and climbed in behind the wheel. "Everything is as it should be," he said, looking around. "The lady has not returned, and the apartment is number 21, second floor, right front side. It has been swept thoroughly. There are no hidden microphones." "That makes sense. The jackal could hardly have been checking personnel all over Paris. It all gets so complicated." "I have arranged entry to Madame Lavier's flat with the concierge. I have identified you all as belonging to the 2e. "Good," said Krupkin, and then to Bourne and Conklin, "Let's go." In the entrance hall, Krupkin nodded at the formally dressed concierge behind the counter. "The door is open," said the concierge, avoiding direct eye contact. Lavier's flat showed that she worked in the world of fashion. The walls were covered with photographs of people in the business, attending important shows and events. Both Conklin and the Russian immediately began examining the tables, picking up handwritten notes. Then Krupkin's radio suddenly gave out 2 sharp sounds. "It must be Sergei," he said. "You're in place, comrade?" "Yes." The assistant's quiet voice came from the radio. "The Lavier woman has just entered the building." "Good." "Alex, put the notes down. Lavier's coming." The sound of a key turning a lock echoed through the living room. The 3 men turned to the door as a shocked Dominique Lavier walked inside. Her astonishment, however, was brief. She calmly replaced the key in her purse and spoke in English. "Well, Crappy, I might have known you were mixed up in this. Ah, the charming Jacqueline. Or may we drop the pretense, Dommy? Kruppy? Cried Conklin. Dummy?
Comrade Krupkin is one of the more public KGB officers in Paris, said Lavie, putting her purse on the table.
It has its advantages, said Krupkin.
I understand you've met our tall American friend here, so I think it is only right I should introduce you to his friend, Alexei Konsolikov.
I don't believe you. He's not Soviet.
You're right. He may introduce himself if he wishes to.
The name's Conklin, Alex Conklin, Miss Lavie, and I'm American. However, my parents were Russian, and I speak the language as well as they did, so my friend Krupkin can't deceive me when we're in Soviet company.
I'm hurt, said Krupkin. But that isn't important here. You will work with us, dummy? I'll work with you, Kruppy. I only ask that Jason Bourne makes clear his offer to me. With Carlos, I'm a caged animal, but without him, I have no money.
Name your price, said Bourne. Write it down, said Conklin, glancing at Krupkin.
Let me see, said Lavie, walking across to the desk. I'm within a few years of 60, from one direction or the other, and I will have maybe 15 to 20 years.
She wrote a figure on a piece of paper and walked across to Bourne.
I'd prefer not to argue. I believe it's fair.
Bourne took the paper and read the amount. $1 million. It's fair, he said, handing the note back to Lavie. Add how and where you want it paid, and I'll make the arrangements when we leave here. The money will be there in the morning.
Lavie looked into Bourne's eyes. I believe you, she said, bending over the desk and writing her instructions. She gave the paper back to him. The deal is made, sir, and may God give us the kill. If he does not, we are dead.
Bourne nodded.
I have several questions, he said.
You want to sit down?
Yes. Lavie crossed to the sofa and settled into it.
What happened at the Maurice Hotel? Said Bourne. How did it happen?
Your woman, I assume it was your woman, screamed as you crossed the street. The rest you saw for yourself. How could you have told me to take a room at the Maurice knowing she was there?
I didn't know. We were here in Paris 13 years ago. My memory of that time isn't good, but the name Maurice means something. Maybe we stayed there. Maybe that's why she chose it. Anyway, what is our position now?
Carlos still trusts me. He blames everything on the woman, your wife, I'm told, and has no reason to hold me responsible.
Bourne nodded. How can you reach him?
I cannot directly, but I can get a message to him. I call several old men at cheap cafes, and they call others. Somehow, the messages get through. Very quickly.
Conklin moved closer to her. I want you to send the most urgent message you have ever sent to the Jackal. You must talk to him directly. It's an emergency, and you can talk about it with nobody except Carlos himself.
About what? Said Krupkin. What could be so urgent that the Jackal will agree to a meeting? Like our Mr. Bourne, he worries about traps.
Conklin shook his head and limped to a side window, deep in thought. He looked down at the street. My God, it could work, he whispered to himself. What could work? Asked Bourne. Dmitri, hurry, call the embassy and have them send the biggest, most impressive limousine you have. The force and urgency of Conklin's command had its effect. The Russian walked rapidly to the telephone and dialed. then spoke into the phone in Russian. "It's done," said the KGB officer. "And now I think you should give me a good reason for doing it." "Moscow," replied Conklin, still looking out the window. "What are you saying?" roared Krupkin. "We've got to get Carlos out of Paris," said Conklin, turning. "Where better than Moscow? In this city, he's got all the firepower, an untraceable network of gunmen and messengers, and many places to hide. London, Amsterdam, Brussels, Rome. They'd all be better for us, but the best is Moscow. Oddly, it's the one place in the world that he can't resist, and also the one that's the least welcoming." "Alex, you're losing your mind," Krupkin said. "What could Domi say that would make him go to Moscow?" "That's easy. The KGB in Moscow is getting closer to the Jackal's man in Dzerzhinsky Square. They know he's one of, let's say, 10 or 15 officers in the highest ranks. When they find him, Carlos can't do anything with the KGB. Worse, he'll lose an informer who knows much too much about him to the men who ask painful questions." "But how would Domi know that?" said Krupkin. "Come over here," Conklin said. "Just you for the moment, and stay away from the window. Look around the side of one of the curtains." The Soviet did as he was told. "What do you see?" asked Conklin, gesturing to an old brown car below on the street. Krupkin did not bother to reply. Instead, he took his radio from his pocket and pressed a button. "Sergei, there's a brown car about 80 meters down the street." "We know, sir," interrupted the assistant. "We're watching it. It's an old man who hardly moves except to look out of the window." "Does he have a car telephone?" "No, comrade. And if he leaves the car, he'll be followed. So there can be no outside calls unless you direct otherwise." "Thank you, Sergei." "The Jackal's man," said Bourne, stepping forward. "Now do you understand?" asked Conklin, speaking to Krupkin. "Of course," replied the KGB official. "After we leave, Carlos is told that a Soviet embassy vehicle was sent to pick us up, and for what other reason would we be here except to question Madame Lavier? Naturally, with me was a tall man who might be Jason Bourne, and another shorter man with a disabled leg, so confirming that it was Jason Bourne. Our connection is therefore made and observed, and again, naturally, during our questioning of Madame Lavier, tempers rose and references were made to the Jackal's informer in Dzerzhinsky Square, which only I'd known about through dealing with Santos at the Soldier's Heart," said Bourne quietly. "So Dominique has a believable observer, an old man from Carlos's army of old men, to support the information she delivers. Alex, that brain of yours hasn't lost its power." "I hear a professor I once knew. I thought he'd left us." "He has. Not for long, I hope." Chapter 13. Moscow. Buckingham Pritchard sat next to his uniformed uncle, Cyril Sylvester Pritchard, Deputy Director of Immigration, in the office of the Crown Governor. Sir Henry Sykes, at Government House, on the island of Montserrat. Beside them, on the Deputy Director's right, was their attorney, the finest local lawyer Sykes could persuade to advise the Pritchards if a case was brought against them for helping terrorists, Jonathan Lemuel, now retired after many years of experience in the highest English courts. Sir Henry sat behind his desk and glanced in shock at Lemuel, who raised his eyes to the ceiling in disbelief. The cause of Sir Henry's shock and Jonathan Lemuel's disbelief was the result of the following exchange between Sykes and the Deputy Director of Immigration. "Mr. Pritchard, you've admitted that your nephew overheard a telephone conversation between John St. Jacques and his brother-in-law, the American Mr. David Webb. Also, your nephew Buckingham Pritchard admits calling you with certain information contained in that conversation. You then told him that you had to contact Paris immediately. Is this true?" "It is all completely true, Sir Henry." "Whom did you reach in Paris? What's the telephone number?" "With respect, sir, I am sworn to secrecy." "What did you say, Mr. Pritchard?" "My nephew and I are part of an international organization involving the great leaders of the world, and we have been sworn to secrecy." "Enough!" shouted Sykes, the veins in his head standing out. "You have both been complete fools. You've been tricked by an international terrorist who is wanted all over the world. Do you know the penalty for helping such a killer? It is death by hanging. Now what's that number in Paris?" "Under the circumstances," said the Deputy Director, speaking calmly despite the fact that his hand shook as he reached for his notebook, "I'll write it down for you. One asks for a blackbird. In French, Sir Henry." As Krupkin entered Moscow's Hotel Metropole with Bourne and Conklin, the manager quietly said, "Comrade, there is an urgent message for you." He walked rapidly up to the KGB man and pushed a folded note into his hand. "I was told to deliver it to you personally." "You have done so, and I thank you." Krupkin watched the man walk away, then opened the paper. "I must call Dzerzhinsky immediately," he said, turning. "It's the extension number of my assistant. Come, let's hurry." In the suite, the doors of the two bedrooms were opposite each other. The space between them was a large sitting room, complete with a bar. "Help yourselves," said Krupkin, heading for a telephone on the desk. "By the way, you'll find your weapons in your bedside table drawers. Each is a 38 Grasburya automatic." Krupkin dialed a number and spoke in Russian. He shook his head as he hung up the telephone. "We must go immediately." "Go where?" Conklin said. "We just got here." "We've taken an apartment on the Sadovaya. That's Moscow's widest street, Mr. Bourne. We'll be using it as our headquarters." The car was parked some way from the hotel, where it would be less obvious. A hotel employee got it for them, and Krupkin drove them across the city. The luxury apartment on the busy Sadovaya was one of many in an old stone building that, like the Hotel Metropole, reflected old Russia. The walls were covered with red wallpaper, and the furniture was elegant. But to the right of the large living room fireplace was a more modern item, a large black television set with a video cassette player. In the apartment was a strongly built man in an untidy uniform, his shirt open at the neck. "For you, I have no name," he said. "You can call me Captain, although my rank is higher." The KGB officer walked to the huge television set and switched it on. "St. Basil's in Red Square," said Krupkin, looking at the screen. "It's a museum now, but occasionally they hold a small religious service." The screen shook as the man carrying the video camera moved inside the building. Then it became steady. It showed an elderly man in a black raincoat. He was walking beside one of the side walls. "Rodchenko," said the captain. "The great Rodchenko." The man on the screen moved into a corner where two large candles threw shadows on the stone walls. Rodchenko approached another man, a priest, losing his hair, thin, his skin dark. "It's him!" cried Bourne. "It's Carlos!" Then a third man appeared on the screen, joining the other two, and Conklin shouted, "My God!" he roared. "Hold it there!" The KGB officer paused the tape. "The other one! Do you recognize him, David?" "I know him, but I don't know him," replied Bourne quietly, as images going back years began filling his mind. There were explosions, white blinding lights with figures running in a jungle, a captain with a snake lady tattooed on his arm. "It's Ogilvy," said Conklin, his voice distant. "Bryce Ogilvy. My God, they did link up. Medusa found the jackal." Chapter 14. A Gunfight. In his bedroom at the Hotel Metropole, Conklin quickly replaced the telephone. Taking his Grasburia automatic out of the bedside table drawer and pushing it into his belt, he crossed to the living room door. Bourne was standing in front of a window. "Was that Krupkin?" asked Bourne. "It was. Move away from there." "Carlos?" Bourne immediately stepped back and turned to Conklin. "He knows we're in Moscow?" he asked, then added, "He knows where we are?" "The answers are yes to both questions. Last night he killed Rodchenko and also Krupkin's two agents who were following him." "God, he's gone mad." "But why do you think—" "One of the agents suffered a lot of pain before he died. He was our driver from the airport. He was also the son of a friend of Krupkin's, not trained for what he had to suffer. Krupkin thinks he probably talked." "I'm sorry about the loss of life. I mean that. I wish it could have happened another way," said Bourne. "We can't do anything about that now. Krupkin's on his way with an assault team, but he hasn't told the hotel staff. The place has to look normal." "Yes, we'll take him here." Bourne noticed the gun in Conklin's belt. He gestured at the weapon. "That's a little obvious, isn't it?" "For whom?" "Room service," replied Bourne. "I phoned for some breakfast and a large pot of coffee." "No. I promised Krupkin that we wouldn't let anybody in here." "That's ridiculous." "Almost my words, but this is his country, not ours." "Wait a minute," said Bourne. "Suppose he's right." Bourne reached under his jacket, pulling out his own Grasburia, and started for the hallway door of the suite. "What are you doing?" cried Conklin. "Get over there," ordered Bourne, pointing to the far left corner of the room. "I'll leave the door unlocked, and when the steward gets here, tell him to come in Russian." "What about you?" "There's a recess down the hall. I'll wait there." Bourne opened the door, glanced up and down the passage, and rushed out. He raced to the recess, occupied by a Pepsi machine, and crouched by the right interior wall. He waited, his knees and legs aching, pains he never felt a few years ago, and then he heard the sounds of rolling wheels. They grew louder and louder as a cart covered with a tablecloth passed and moved to the door of the suite. The floor steward was a young man in his 20s, blond and short. Cautiously, he knocked on the door. Not Carlos, thought Bourne, getting painfully to his feet. He could hear Conklin's voice telling the steward to enter, and as the young man opened the door, Pushing the cart inside, Bourne calmly replaced his weapon. He bent over, rubbing his right leg. It happened suddenly. A figure in black came out of an unseen recess farther down the passage, racing past the machine. Bourne spun back into the wall. It was the jackal. Madness! At full force, Carlos hit the steward with his right shoulder, pushing the young man across the hallway and crashing the cart over on its side, food and coffee spilling across the carpeted floor. Suddenly, the steward moved to his left as, astonishingly, he pulled a weapon from his belt. The jackal either sensed or caught the movement in the corner of his eye. He spun around, his machine pistol on rapid fire, pinning the blond Russian into the wall, bullets tearing through the steward's head and body. In that long, horrible moment, the barrel of Bourne's Grasburia caught in the waistline of his pants. He tore the fabric as the eyes of Carlos swept up, centering on his own, anger and victory in the assassin's stare. Bourne pulled the gun loose, spinning, crouching back into the small recess as the jackal's bullets blew apart the front of the soft drink machine. On his stomach, Bourne moved across the opening, the Grasburia raised and firing as fast as he could. At the same time, there were other gunshots, not those of a machine pistol. Conklin was firing from inside the suite. They had Carlos in their crossfire. It was possible. It could all end in a hotel passage in Moscow. Let it happen. Let it happen. The jackal roared, angry at having been hit. Bourne threw himself back into the recess. Again he crouched. Like an angry, caged animal, the wounded Carlos kept firing bursts from his weapon. 2 frightened screams came from the far end of the hallway, 1 male, 1 female. A couple had been wounded or killed in the storm of bullets. "Get down!" Conklin screamed from across the passage. "Take cover!" Bourne did as he was told, pushing himself into the corner of the recess, protecting his head as much as possible. The first explosion shook the walls, somewhere, and then a second one, much nearer, in the hallway itself. Grenades! Smoke mixed with the broken glass. Gunshots. 9, one after another, a Grasburia automatic. Alex! Bourne got up from the corner of the recess and moved through the opening. Conklin stood outside the door of their suite. He searched the pockets of his pants. "He ran around the corner into the other passage. My gun's empty and I don't have any more bullets." "I do, and I'm a lot faster than you," said Bourne, reloading his gun. "Get back in there and call downstairs. Tell them to clear the area. Krupkin said, I don't care what he said. Tell him to shut down the elevators, close all stair exits, and stay away from this floor." Bourne raced down the hallway, slowing as he approached the couple who lay on the carpet. Each moved in pain. Their clothes were spotted with blood, but they moved. He turned and shouted to Conklin. "Get help up through here," he ordered, pointing at an exit door down the passage. "They're alive!" He moved on, but he knew already that it was too late to catch up with Carlos. A day later, Bourne, Conklin, and Krupkin sat in the living room of the hotel suite waiting for news. The door opened, and the KGB officer who called himself a captain entered. He looked at the 3 men and spat out one word. "Novgorod." "What?" the men cried together. "You," the officer addressed Bourne, switching to English. "You understood." "I know the name," Bourne said. "He broke into a weapons store at Kubinka. He killed the staff there, though some escaped. He stole guns,
plastic explosives, heat-seeking missiles. The store is on the road to Novgorod. He's going back to the place of his birth, said Krupkin, to the training camp where Ilyich Ramirez Sanchez became Carlos the Jackal. He's going there because he was thrown out, marked for death as a madman. What will he do in Novgorod? Asked Bourne quietly. Who knows? He intends to leave his mark, no doubt, in answer to the people he believes betrayed him more than 30 years ago. He probably has papers to get him inside. I can't believe he hasn't, but we'll stop him. Don't even try, said Bourne. He may or may not use the papers. Like me, he doesn't need them to get inside. But if he senses something is wrong, and he will, he'll kill a number of good men and still get in. What are you saying? Asked Krupkin cautiously. Get me inside ahead of him, with a detailed map of the whole complex and a document that allows me to go wherever I want to. You've lost your senses, cried Krupkin. An American? An assassin inside Novgorod? I haven't the slightest interest in your training facility. My only concern is Carlos. I want him dead, and so do you. All right, said Conklin from his chair, his eyes on the ceiling. He looked straight at Krupkin. Let's deal. You get him into Novgorod, and you keep Ogilvy. We've already got him, Alexei. You haven't. Washington knows he's here. So? So, I can say you lost him, and they'll believe me. Think of it. No world court embarrassments, none of the problems caused by holding an American accused of international crimes. You take over the Medusa operation with no complications. And who better to be in charge than you? A cultured man with experience of living in the West? Forget the house in Geneva, Kruppy. How about a villa on the Black Sea? It is a most intelligent and attractive offer, said Krupkin thoughtfully. No, 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 shouted the KGB officer. This is crazy. Oh, for God's sake, shut up, roared Krupkin. We're talking about things you cannot possibly understand. What? Like a young child criticized by an adult, the officer was both surprised and frightened by Krupkin's words. Very well, said Krupkin, his own eyes now on the ceiling. The order will be issued secretly, its origins untraceable. How fast can I get there? Asked Bourne. There's a lot I have to organize. We have an airport in Vnukovo under our control, no more than an hour away. First, I must make arrangements. Hand me a telephone. You, my stupid comrade. The officer moved quickly, bringing a phone to Krupkin's table. One more thing, Bourne said. Have TASS put out an immediate news release with heavy coverage in the newspapers, radio, and television that the assassin known as Jason Bourne died of his wounds here in Moscow. Don't give too much detail, but they will need to know something of what happened here this morning. That's not difficult. TASS is an obedient servant of the state. Chapter 15. Novgorod. Novgorod. It was a work of great inventiveness, cut out of the immense forests along the Volkhov River. From the moment Bourne appeared from the deep underground tunnel below the water, with its guards, gates, and many cameras,
He was close to being in a state of shock. The American compound, presumably like those of the other countries, was broken up into sections, built on areas up to a kilometer square, each distinctly separate from the others. One area, on the banks of the river, might be the heart of a main village by the ocean. Another, further inland, a small southern town. Another, a busy city street. Each was completely real, with the appropriate vehicles, police, stores and drugstores, gas stations, and office buildings. The people who worked there dressed as local people would. Obviously, as important as the physical appearances was language, not just the use of excellent English, but the mastery of regional differences. As Bourne wandered from one section to another, he heard all around him the distinctive sounds of New England, of Texas, of the Midwest, and the large eastern cities. It was all unbelievable. Bourne followed the signs. Everything was in English. To the city of Rockledge, Florida. He was going to meet a man called Benjamin at a lunch counter in the local Woolworth store. He was looking for a man in his mid-20s with a Budweiser baseball cap on the high chair beside him, saving the place. It was time. 3:35 in the afternoon. He saw him. The sandy-haired Russian was seated at the far right end of the counter. There were half a dozen men and women along the row, talking to one another over soft drinks and snacks. Bourne approached the empty seat, glanced down at the cap, and spoke politely. "Is this taken?" he asked. "I'm waiting for somebody," replied the young KGB trainer. "I'm just having a quick Coke. I'll be out of here in a few minutes." "Sit down," said Benjamin, removing the hat and putting it on his head. A waiter came by and Bourne ordered. His drink arrived, and the KGB trainer continued quietly. "So, you're Archie. And you're Benjamin. Nice to know you. We'll both find out if that's a fact, won't we? Do we have a problem? I don't approve of you being here. I've lived in the United States and I sound American, but I don't like Americans." "Listen to me, Ben," interrupted Bourne, his eyes forcing the trainer to look at him. "I haven't the slightest interest in the purpose of Novgorod, although the whole complex is a lot more impressive than Disneyland." Benjamin tried hard not to laugh and failed. "Come on," said Bourne. "Let's take a walk." 8 hours later, at exactly 12:02 a.m., the telephone in the command suite screamed. Benjamin leaped off the couch and grabbed the phone. "Yes? Where? When? And he's inside?" "Yes!" He put the phone down and turned to Bourne. "It's unbelievable. At the Spanish tunnel across the river, 2 guards are dead. And on this side, the officer of the guard was found 50 meters away from his post, a bullet in his throat. They ran the videotapes, and all they saw was an unidentified man walking through carrying a bag, in a guard's uniform." "What else?" asked Bourne coldly. On the other side was a dead farm worker holding torn papers in his hand. He was lying between the 2 murdered guards, one of them only wearing his shorts and shoes. How did he do it? The farm worker was working for him. Carlos must have paid him a lot and sent him in with rotten false papers, then run in himself. The officer appeared at the right time and caught the farm worker, and in the confusion, Carlos got through the tunnel. But the papers he used, everything had to be checked against the computer. Those were Krupkin's instructions. I think you have to accept that Carlos has somebody inside here, somebody with authority. That's possible, agreed the young trainer rapidly. So let's go, and when we get outside we stop somewhere and you get me what I need. Okay, that's been approved. The Jackal braked the huge fuel truck at the West German border. He adjusted the coarse shirt that covered a Spanish general's uniform, and as the guard came out of the gatehouse, Carlos spoke in Russian, using the same words he had used at every other crossing. "Don't ask me to speak the stupid language you talk here. I deliver gas. I don't spend time in classrooms. Here's my key." "I barely speak it myself, comrade," said the guard, laughing as he accepted the small, flat object and pushed it into the computerized machine. The heavy iron barrier moved up into the vertical position. The guard returned the key, and the Jackal sped through into a small West Berlin. In the narrow copy of a main street, he slowed down and pulled the gas release. The fuel flowed out into the street. He then reached into the open bag on the seat beside him, took out the small pre-timed plastic explosives, and, as he had done throughout the southern compounds to the border of France, threw them through the lowered windows on both sides of the truck toward the wooden buildings he thought would burn best. He sped into the Munich section, then to the port of Bremerhaven on the river, and finally into Bonn, flooding the street, throwing out the explosives. He had barely 15 minutes before the first explosions took place in all of West Germany, followed by explosions in the other compounds, each spaced 8 minutes apart, timed to create maximum effect. And while the fire engines raced here and there, and the frightened people tried to escape, Ilyich Ramirez Sanchez would burn Paris. Then would come England, and finally the largest compound in Novgorod, the United States of America, country of the second-rate assassin, Jason Bourne. Carlos checked his bag. What remained were the most dangerous instruments of death found in the weapons store of Kubinka. 4 rows of short, heat-seeking missiles, 20 in all. When they were sent into the sky, each would seek the sources of fire and do its work. Bourne stopped the jeep at the entrance to the French compound and handed the guard his computerized card. "Quickly, please," he said in French. The guard walked rapidly to the security machine as an enormous fuel truck, heading the other way, passed through into England. The guard returned, and the iron barrier was raised. Bourne accelerated and saw in a matter of moments a 3-floor copy of the Eiffel Tower. "Slow down," said Benjamin, touching his arm. "What is it?" "Stop!" cried the young trainer. "Shut off the engine." Bourne drove to the side of the road and switched off. "What's the matter with you?" Benjamin was looking around him, his eyes on the clear night sky. "No clouds," he said. "No storms." "So what? I want to get up to the Spanish compound." There it goes again. Now Bourne heard it. Far away, the sound of distant thunder. But the night was clear. It happened again, and again, and again, one deep sound after another. "There!" shouted the young Soviet, standing up in the jeep and pointing to the north. "What is it?" "That's fire, young man," answered Bourne softly, as he also stood up and stared at the yellow light in the distant sky. "And my guess is it's the Spanish compound. He was initially trained there, and that's what he came back to do, to blow the place up. It's his revenge." "Get down. We've got to get up there." "No, you're wrong. Benjamin interrupted, quickly lowering himself into the seat as Bourne started the engine and pulled the jeep into gear. Spain's no more than 8 kilometers from here. Those fires are a lot farther away. Just show me the fastest route, said Bourne, pressing the accelerator to the floor. As they came in sight of the Spanish border, the explosions were louder and the night sky turned a brighter shade of yellow. The guards at the gate were talking quickly into their telephones and handheld radios. The sounds of police cars and fire engines were joining the shouting and the screaming. "What's happening?" shouted Benjamin, leaping from the jeep and speaking Russian. "I'm senior staff," he added, slipping the card into the release equipment, sending the barrier up. "Tell me." "Madness, comrade," shouted an officer from the gatehouse window. "Unbelievable. First, West Germany. All over there are explosions and fires in the streets and buildings going up in flames. Then it happens in Italy. Rome burns down, and in the Greek section, and still the explosions continue." Another wall phone rang inside the gatehouse. The officer of the guard picked it up, then screamed at the top of his lungs. "Madness! It's complete madness! Are you certain?" "What is it?" roared Benjamin, rushing to the window. "Egypt!" he screamed, his ear pressed to the telephone. "Israel! Fires everywhere! Bombs everywhere!" "Get back here!" shouted Bourne. Benjamin ran to the jeep and jumped in as Bourne accelerated through the gate. It was the fuel truck. That damn fuel truck that passed us at the French border. That was him. "Yes, but where are we going?" Benjamin shouted. "It'll end in the American compound. It has to." The copy of the White House fell in flames, and Pennsylvania Avenue was on fire. Bourne stopped the jeep in the street beside the river, and again there were frightened crowds. The police were shouting through loudspeakers, first in English, then in Russian, explaining that the river was wired and that the electricity would kill anybody trying to swim across. The searchlights showed the floating bodies of those who had tried this in the northern compounds. "The tunnel! The tunnel! Open the tunnel!" Bourne leaped out of the jeep, pocketing 3 flares, and fought his way through the crowds. Benjamin ran after him. There, in the fenced-off parking lot, was the fuel truck. He broke through the guards, holding up his computerized release card, and ran up to a captain with an AK-47 on his waist. "My identification is with the name Archie, and you can check it immediately." "Of course we know of you," the officer cried. "But what can I do? This is an uncontrollable situation." "Has anybody passed through the tunnel in the last half hour?" "No one. Absolutely no one. Our orders are to keep it closed." "Good. Get on the loudspeakers and tell the crowds to break up. Tell them the crisis has passed and the danger with it." "How can I? The fires are everywhere. The explosions everywhere." "Do as he says," roared Benjamin's voice behind Bourne. "Who gives me such orders?" shouted the officer. "Check my authority, friend, but do it quickly," answered Benjamin, holding out his card. "Move, you fool!" "Attention!" The voice came from the many loudspeakers around the tunnel as the explosions began to die down. "The crisis has passed. Stay by the banks of the river and we will look after you. These are orders from our superiors, comrades." "But we're being attacked!" shouted a man at the front of the panicked crowd. "Open the tunnel and let us out, or you'll have to shoot us down. Open the tunnel!" the people cried. The protesting voices grew louder.
Can you operate the tunnel's machinery?" Bourne shouted. "Yes, everybody on the senior staff can. It's part of the job." "The iron gates you told me about." "Of course." "Where are the controls?" "The guardhouse." "Get in there," shouted Bourne to Benjamin, taking one of the flares out of his field jacket pocket and handing it to him. "When you see one of my flares go over the crowd, lower those gates on this side, only this side, understood?" "What for?" "My rules, Ben. Do it. Then light this flare and throw it out the window so I know it's done." "Then what?" "Something you may not want to do, but you have to. Take the gun from the captain's body and force the crowd. Shoot it back into the street. Rapid fire into the ground in front of them or above them. Do whatever you have to do." The trainer, named Benjamin, looked angrily at Bourne, then turned and began fighting his way to the guardhouse. Bourne studied the fenced parking area, counting the other vehicles in addition to the fuel truck. There were 9 parked by the fence, 6 cars and 3 vans, all American-made or good copies. Bourne crouched and crawled forward. He reached the waist-high fence, the noise behind him continuous, deafening. Then, from an opening he could not see, 2 police cars raced inside. Uniformed men leaped out from every door and ran to the open gate that led to the guardhouse and tunnel. There was a break in space, in time, in men. 3 men had come out of the second car, but now there were 4. But he was not the same. The uniform was not the same. The officer's cap had a gold ribbon, and the shape was wrong for the U.S. Army. What was it? And suddenly, Bourne understood. His memory went back years to Madrid. It was a Spanish uniform. That was it. Carlos had entered through the Spanish compound, and as his Russian was excellent, he was using the high-ranking uniform to make his escape from Novgorod. Bourne got to his feet, his automatic in his hand, and ran across the lot, his left hand reaching into his field jacket pocket for a flare. He pulled the release and threw it above the cars. Benjamin would not see it from the guardhouse and mistake it for the signal to close the gates of the tunnel. "Look out!" roared one of the escaping men, turning around and panicked at the sight of the blinding flare. "Run!" shouted another, racing toward the open section of the fence. Bourne counted the 7 figures as one by one they ran away from the last car and passed through the opening, joining the excited crowds at the mouth of the tunnel. The 8th man did not appear. The Spanish officer's uniform was not in sight. The jackal was trapped. Now, Bourne took out a flare, pulled the release, and threw it with all his strength at the guardhouse. "Do it, Ben," he screamed in silence as he took out the last grenade. "Do it now." A thunderous roar came from the tunnel, frightened protests from the crowd, then 2 rapid bursts of automatic gunfire were followed by commands over the speakers, shouted in Russian. Bourne dropped to the ground, looking at the undersides of the vehicles. A pair of legs, in boots, behind the 3rd car on the left. He gripped the grenade in his right hand, pulled the pin, and threw it under the car toward the legs, only at the last moment realizing that he had made a terrible error. The legs behind the car did not move. The boots remained in place, because they were only boots. Bourne threw himself away from the car onto the ground and curled his body into the smallest mass he could manage.
The explosion was deafening. Pieces of glass and metal stinging Bourne's back and legs. He got to his feet in the smoke and fire. As he did so, the ground was torn up around him. He ran toward the protection of the nearest vehicle, a square-shaped van. He was hit twice, in the shoulder and thigh.
"You're nothing compared to me, Jason Bourne," screamed Carlos the Jackal, his automatic weapon on rapid fire. "You never were. You're a pretender, a fraud."
"Then come and get me." Bourne moved to the driver's door, pulled it open, then ran to the back of the vehicle where he crouched, his face to the edge, his Colt .45 next to his cheek. The Jackal stopped his continuous fire. Bourne understood. Carlos faced the open door, unsure, indecisive, only seconds to go. Metal against metal, a gun barrel was pushed against the door, shutting it. Now! Bourne spun around the edge of the van, his weapon firing into the Spanish uniform, blowing the gun out of the Jackal's hands. 1, 2, 3, the bullets flew through the air, and then they stopped. They stopped as the gun stuck, refusing to fire. Carlos dropped to the ground for his weapon, his left arm limp and bleeding, but his right hand still strong. Bourne pulled out his knife and leaped forward, slicing the blade down toward the Jackal's arm. He was too late. Carlos held the weapon. Bourne's hand held the hot barrel. "Hold on. Hold on. You can't let it go. Twist it. Use the knife." With a last desperate effort, Bourne pushed up and crashed Carlos back into the side of the van, striking his wounded shoulder again and again. The Jackal screamed, dropping the weapon, then kicked it under the van. Where the blow came from, Bourne at first did not know. He only knew that the left side of his head seemed suddenly to split in two. Then he realized that he had done it to himself. He had slipped on the blood-covered ground and had crashed into the side of the van. It did not matter. Nothing mattered. Carlos the Jackal was racing away. With the confusion everywhere, there were 100 ways he could get out of Novgorod. It had all been for nothing. Still, there was his last grenade. Why not? Bourne removed it, pulled the pin, and threw it over the van into the center of the parking area. The explosion followed, and Bourne got to his feet. Maybe the grenade would tell Benjamin something, warn him to keep his eyes on the area. Barely able to walk, Bourne started for the break in the fence that led to the guardhouse and the tunnel. "Oh, God, Marie, I failed. I'm so sorry. Nothing. It was all for nothing." And then, as if all Novgorod were having a final laugh at his expense, he saw that somebody had opened the iron gates to the tunnel, giving the Jackal his invitation to freedom. "Archie?" The young Soviet ran out of the guardhouse toward Bourne. "God, I thought you were dead." "So you opened the gates to let my killer walk away?" shouted Bourne weakly. "Why didn't you send a limousine for him?" "I suggest you look again, Professor," replied a breathless Benjamin, studying Bourne's bruised face and blood-stained clothing. "Old age has damaged your eyesight." "What?" "You want gates? You'll have gates." The trainer shouted an order toward the guardhouse in Russian. Seconds later, the huge iron gates descended, covering the mouth of the tunnel. But something was strange. The gates appeared to be swollen somehow, shiny and showing reflections. "Glass," said Benjamin. "Glass?" asked a puzzled Bourne. At each end of the tunnel, 8-centimeter walls of glass locked up. "What are you talking about?" It was not necessary for the young Russian to explain. Suddenly, a series of huge waves crashed against the glass as the tunnel filled with the waters of the Volkhov River. Then, within the silence of the growing, moving liquid, there was an object, a thing, a body. Bourne stared in shock, unable to release the cry that was in him. He gathered what strength he had left and ran unsteadily to the wall of glass. Breathlessly, he placed his hands against it and looked at the scene barely centimeters in front of him. The dead body of Carlos the Jackal kept crashing back and forward into the steel bars of the gate. His features twisted in hate. Jason Bourne watched in satisfaction, his mouth tight, the face of a killer among killers, who had won. Briefly, however, the softer eyes of David Webb appeared, forming the face of a man for whom the weight of a world he hated had been removed.